And welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've started to record the webinar. Great. So firstly, let me just introduce myself. My name is Josephine Lee, and I'm the Marketing Manager at Miller Heiman Group in APAC, and I'll be supporting today's webinar. So please kindly note that I do have everyone on mute, but please do feel free to ask questions in the questions box at any time throughout the webinar, and we will answer these during the Q&A session. So just on today's agenda, we will be discussing the top 4 priorities that sales leaders are focusing on in 2019. These priorities are improve lead generation, capture new accounts, expand existing account business, and increase win rates. There will also be key takeaways and an opportunity for Q&A. We have some really exciting thought-provoking content to cover with 2 very credible speakers. With this, I am very pleased to welcome Priya Sachdev, Sales Director of Miller Heiman Group APAC, and Seleste Lunsford, Managing Director of CSO Insights. So let me just say, or should I say introduce this to anyone who's new to Miller Heiman Group, that we are truly a global company. We have Priya joining us from Mumbai, India. Then we have Seleste joining us from Chicago, although Seleste is normally based in Tampa, Florida. And I'm supporting this webinar all the way from Sydney, Australia. Plus, we also have attendees today from Singapore, China, Malaysia, the US, and many more international locations. So with this, I do truly hope our global internet connectivity plays nice for all of us and that there isn't too much delay, but please note there may be just a few seconds lag in between slides. So back to welcoming our speakers. Priya has been a sales practitioner for over 25 years. She has predominantly worked in B2B and complex sales, which includes experience in managing and owning successful business organizations across industries. Priya has consulted with sales and service organizations for more than 15 years, helping them acquire, grow, and retain client relationships. And Seleste is the Managing Director for CSO Insights, the independent research arm of Miller Heiman Group. Seleste has been a leader in the sales performance industry for over 20 years, holding executive roles in professional services, product development, and operations. She has also co-authored 2 books, published dozens of white papers, and written articles on topics such as sales effectiveness and much more. Please also just know that Priya and Seleste's social media handles are on the slide, as they are both content specialists and actively share a lot of insights on LinkedIn and Twitter. So please feel free to follow them. So a very warm welcome to both Priya and Seleste. So to start us off, I'll pass it over to you, Seleste. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and good day, everybody. CSO Insights is in the business of sales research. So what we do is each year we go out and we work with sales leaders from sales organizations all over the world to figure out what is the current state of sales and what are the trends. Are things going up? Are they going down? What's working? What's not working? And so in our annual study this year, we worked with organizations from 886 companies around the world, of which 150 were in APAC. And part of that study each year is to understand, are things better than they were the year before or worse? What was interesting about this year's study is it was a little bit of both. So revenue attainment, meaning did the organization make the number? Did we achieve our goals for the year? That was up for the 3rd year in a row. Right now it's hovering just shy of 94%. So for the most part, organizations are making the number. But if you look at the next set of metrics, you peel the onion back 1 layer to those leading indicators, they were all extremely flat versus the last couple of years. So for example, the percentage of salespeople who are making their quota or exceeding it was only 54.3%. And last year it was 53%. So it's basically just a bit of a wobble, whereas it was around 63%. And as a sales leader, what you're driving for is you kind of want quota attainment to be in that 60 to 70% range, right? If too many people are achieving quota, it probably means you haven't set it aggressively enough. But 54 is still quite low for what you would be targeting. So we would have expected if a company is making its number, it's because more of its salespeople are successful. But that wasn't the case. The other thing that was very flat was conversion rate. So the percentage of things that are converting from the top of the funnel into first demonstrations, those sorts of figures, those were all exactly flat versus last year as well, as win rates were. So we didn't see a lot of movement in things that you would really think would be driving revenue forward. What was really interesting, though, is we ask all these questions each year about practices. So what is it that salespeople are effective at? What are the opportunities? And we change some of those each year to accommodate new selling techniques and methodologies. There's a core set of around 16 that we ask every year so we can collect some trend data. 15 of those 16 actually scored worse this year than they did 5 years ago. Things like being able to present ROI, identifying all the decision makers in an account. So what we found is that sales leaders are making their number, but it's not necessarily by pulling the lever of the performance of their salespeople. And so because of that, sales organizations are really in this vulnerable place, right? They know they can't continue to do things as they have done, or once the economies start to drop a bit, they're going to be very exposed. So what we did in the survey is we wanted to follow up, understand what are those levers that you're pulling? And as a sales executive, what is the most likely way you're going to meet your number next year? And that's where those 4 things that Priya mentioned came up, the sales leader's top 4 goals. And to repeat them again, they were improving lead generation, capturing new accounts, expanding business in existing accounts, and increasing win rates. What we're going to do in today's webinar is we're going to talk a little bit about each of those 4. I'm going to share what the research said, why it was so difficult, and yet what we were seeing statistically as making the difference. And then my colleague Priya is going to chime in and bring some of those examples to life with real-life situations. So with that as context, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the first one, which was improved lead generation. I'd be curious to know, so I'll ask Jo if she'd be willing to launch a poll for us. When you think about lead generation and your organization's going into 2019, how confident are you that you're going to be able to get enough leads in the hands of your sellers to meet 2019 goals? That's something that you would say you're very confident in, just somewhat confident, not very confident, or you definitely know that's going to be a challenge for you. If everybody could answer that poll, that would be great. We can compare it to some of the things that we learned in our study this year.
Yep, so we're getting quite a few responses, so I'll just give everyone a few moments to respond to the poll. Great, and I'm just going to close it and I will quickly show the responses.
Perfect, thank you. So interesting, you guys range somewhere between somewhat confident and not very confident. So a few of you were very confident, so I would say congratulations to you guys for sure. What's interesting is I think that's pretty typical of what sales leaders would say. So if you think about, those 4 things that I mentioned, well, those are the business of sales, right? Every sales leader is worried about all 4 of those things each year. But usually there's going to be one that's going to be more critical. So there was this subgroup of sales leaders who said that was the thing they wanted to focus more on. What was interesting is we also asked people for lessons learned. And we said, hey, you guys have been working on transformation projects forever. You tweak a lot of things. What's an example of something that you have done and you've stopped doing because the initiative failed or it didn't produce the results you were looking for? And the number one thing that popped was people had abandoned lead gen campaigns of some size. So we see a lot of trial and error in the lead gen space. So moving us forward, Jo, I think the big issue, though, is that lead generation is still seen in a sales issue. And so what I mean by that is we asked sales organizations, because they're the people that we research, where they got their leads from. And you'll see here on the yellow bar, the perception of sales is that the majority of the leads were still coming from the sales organization. And this has been true for the last couple of years that we've done this study. And that marketing was only producing about 20% of the leads. And you'll see a few things coming from referrals, and then a few coming from service and some other things. But predominantly, sales still on the hook for providing most of their own leads. Now, I would say there's a couple of caveats about that particular data point. And the first is, as I mentioned, we reached out to 886 sales executives. If we had reached out to 886 CMOs, I'm pretty sure they would have told us something different. So there's certainly that that difference of opinion that goes back in time. But there's also some legitimate differences in terms of who's responsible for warming up leads and passing them on to sales. And increasingly, we're seeing lots more organizations use sales development reps or inside lead nurturers. Some of those departments report to marketing and some report to sales. So depending on the org structure is also an explanation for this particular graph. But I think the biggest thing as we started to ask more questions on this topic was that there's still all this debate over what exactly do we mean when we see there is a lead. And so there still is this huge silo. There's these differences, this big gap between sales and marketing. And those silos are really what's hampering lead generation success. We followed up on this question in terms of where leads come from to take a step back and say, okay, so where exactly, what do you mean when you say leads? So Joe, if we could move to the next slide. What we found is that only 29.5% of sales and marketing teams had a common definition of what a lead was. So that's not a lot. Not only is that not a lot, unfortunately, that's much lower than it was just 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, that yellow bar was much taller. About half the people in our studies said, yes, marketing and I have formally documented what we think qualifies a lead. Maybe it's a specific score, it meets certain criteria, but we've both signed off on that, shaken hands and said that's the lead. You'll see a few more in the informal range, which means we more or less view leads in a similar way, but we haven't actually documented it, and there's still quite a bit of debate. So I asked Priya to chime in now because I'm curious of the clients that she's been working with, if she sees this lead gen issue as much in her clientele.
Hey, thanks, Celeste, for that. Leads are close to my heart, and I'm sure close to all the sellers who are listening in today as well. We always have this conversation about who owns the leads and a bit of this kind of friction between sales and marketing in terms of saying who gets better leads. This IT services organization that we worked with recently, in fact, for creating better sales marketing alignment, created teams like inside sales, pre-sales, and field sales. And this was done to ensure that they have different teams taking care of different elements of the sales process. Now, one would have thought that once you've got different teams, you've got better ownership, your cost of acquisition of prospects or customers comes out, and you get better at this. But this really didn't happen for them. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that they started talking to us. And when we went deeper, we realized that the issue was that while they did create different teams, now these teams were working in what you call silos. It was not just about having it aligned to their sales process, but what was missing was having it aligned to the buyer process. So I think, Celeste, one thing important there also is to have common guidelines and see how does it align to the buyer process and have like a common sales methodology there. Otherwise, this certainly is not going to give the results one would expect, right?
Exactly, and it's a really good point you make, because I find sometimes, this is certainly not a new problem, right? We've been talking about lead gen for a very long time. And I find sometimes the more you throw at it to try to fix it, the more complicated the process becomes. So to your point exactly about, it's not just how do we define the lead, it's how do we work together. We also ask people to tell us about the process, right? So who are all the roles involved in lead gen and how are they working together? And again, it was small. Only about a third said we've sat down with sales and marketing and we have this jointly agreed process for how the handoffs are going to work and how we're going to measure things. And it even gets worse because if you think about the slide I shared about lead definition, we found that only 20%, so 1 in 5 organizations actually said yes to both these questions, that I have a formal lead definition and a formal process and a way to work together. And it's a shame because with all the activity around ABM and SDRs and a ton of different other acronyms, this is something that hasn't gotten a lot better despite all the effort. Now, Priya mentioned a couple of best practices that we found in our study as well. So in terms of recommendations, we're going to share a couple of things through the course of this webinar today, but there are also a lot more that we uncovered in our research. And so at the end of the webinar, we're going to share some more information about how we can give you a little bit more of the research. You can see more of these things blown out and more description. But for tonight, we'll highlight a couple of things. So one is exactly what Priya was mentioning, this formalized collaboration. But the second point she brought up, I want to highlight a bit, and that's about aligning things to the customer path. So we've always talked about maybe mapping the sales process or being customer-centric, those sorts of things. This is something a lot more formal and scientific than that. What we're talking about here is exactly what is the customer journey from awareness all the way through to implementation. Who are all the roles in your organization involved with that? And what should that experience feel like, right? What's your brand promise for the relationship that you're creating? And sometimes I think we get a little too worried about aligning departments with each other, as opposed to the fact that if you just align them all with the customer, then by default, they would be in alignment with each other. And so I didn't want to miss that comment that Priya shared, because I think it's really important, and that it's one thing to connect to each other, but if it's still not how the customer wants the relationship to occur, that alignment's not going to have a lot of payoff. Let's move into the second thing. So there was one group of sales leaders who said, listen, I got to fill my pipeline. There was another group of sales leaders who said, listen, the biggest way that I'm going to hit my 2019 number is new logos. I've got to get some more new logos, new customers to us to be part of our organization. So I'll ask Joe to push a little poll out, because I'm curious, for those who are joining us today, what your approach is in terms of new logo acquisition. How effective would you say your approach is to close a new customer, someone who's not currently doing business for you? Would you say it exceeds expectations, which is a scale we use to say, hey, we excel at this. This is how we do business. We're very good at this. It meets expectations, so we do an acceptable job of that. Obviously, some room for improvement. Needs improvement means we have some targets for new account acquisition, but we're not making the numbers we would prefer. Needs major redesign means this is a very critical pain point for us. So Joe, let me know when you find people are able to respond to the poll.
Yep, we're getting a few more through, so I'll just give everyone a moment to put their responses in.
Perfect.
Yep, great. And I think we've got a good response rate, so I'll just quickly share the responses.
Perfect. So this is interesting. So again, we've got, looks like one or two really high performers, but most people said this was something that needs improvement. And so if you go to the next slide, Joe, you'll see that was true of our overall population as well. So there was certainly a group of sales leaders who said, this is my number one priority for the year. But even the other ones in this study also said, this is still not an area we excel at. There just wasn't a lot of organizations who said that was a strong point or an organizational strength for them. So given those same four choices that we gave you guys, what you'll see is that only 4.2% ended up in that we feel good about it. The vast majority were just like you, said this needs improvement, or 61%. And what's interesting is every year we ask sales leaders, what's the most important thing you got to do to make your number next year? Capturing new accounts almost always comes in as number one or number two. And yet, when we ask organizations what percentage of revenue comes from new accounts versus existing, only 30% of revenues comes from new accounts. Most organizations are still completely dependent on existing accounts and aren't generating the new logos that they would like. And when it came to this capability of how good are you at closing new business, this one in particular was the lowest of any of the 60 questions that we asked in this year's survey. So again, I'll ask Priya to talk a little bit about when you have an organization who's suffering from this kind of challenge, what have you seen work?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? We put in all the effort to get new logos in, and yet it's rated as the lowest capability.
Right.
We recently worked with this organization who does large projects, and they are a manufacturing and services company. And when we met with the sales leader, he said, my team is less of sales and more of proposal making. And
Right.
when we asked him what does he mean by that, he said, we are churning out proposals every day. And for these guys to churn out proposals, there's a lot of cost because they need to bring in their specialists or their engineers into play and figure out a lot of plans before they can even submit a proposal. So conversion ratio being low actually increases the cost of acquisition for them. And one would think people would figure this out, right? But I think as sellers, we have these happy ears. We always believe we are going to win every deal that comes to our table. And what happens is we spread ourselves too thin. Maybe somewhere where we traditionally learned about sales, we learned about going after everything that came our way. And one thing we are missing out is how do we prioritize on that? In fact, when we started to ask this organization to say, what's your criteria to decide if this is a customer you want to go after, they really didn't have a clear, spelled out objective criteria. And in my mind, that becomes a very important thing because if the sales team doesn't have that laser sharp focus to know what they're going to go after, they will go after everything, right? So, in my mind, Celeste, one thing that's really helped them change that is that we help them create an ideal customer criteria. And ideal customer criteria was not only about who do I want to go after, but also when is my customer willing to have that conversation that I want to have with them. And I think that has been critical.
It's funny. When you said happy ears, I was with an organization myself recently, and they explained to me that one of their mothers had told them that salespeople were like alligators because they had little ears and big mouths. So I'd rather have happy ears than little ears. But you're exactly right. It's this: you have to have a certain amount of optimism, or else you're never going to be successful in sales, right? So how do you temper that with a little bit of focus? And the additional data that I'll share on this one is actually from the opposite side of the fence, right? So in addition to the study that we do each year with, 900 to 1,000 sales organizations, we also do a study with regard to B2B buyers. So we reached out earlier this year to 500 B2B buyers to understand how they prefer to buy and what their thoughts and experiences were with salespeople. 70% of them said that they waited until after they'd already figured out their needs and they already knew, they prioritized what their business issues were before engaging a salesperson, because they really just didn't see salespeople as business problem solvers, right? It was more like access to products. Almost half of them, 44%, said, I actually wait a little longer until I go out and research in the marketplace and know exactly the solutions that I want. And then I put those salespeople in a small box and basically have them present to exactly what I want to hear. And then 20% even said, no, I basically just push out an RFP at the end and let people bid on it, but I've got everything figured out myself. So when you go back to your story about proposal writers, unless you have an ideal customer profile right, you don't know which of these donut charts you're dealing with. You don't know if you're dealing with someone who's still relatively early in the process, or someone who really just wants a bid and you'd want to spend less time on. Sure. Interestingly, one of the things that we asked in this survey is we wanted to understand, well, is this a done deal, right? Does a salesperson have a chance to get in earlier? And even with the people who preferred late engagement, they were open to salespeople having more involvement earlier on if it was a situation they felt like was challenging for them or their organization, if they felt like what they were trying to accomplish was risky or particularly complex. They also were more willing to engage with salespeople if their personal profile was they were more likely to be risk takers. They were more likely to want to get lots of opinions earlier on. And also, if they generally had good experiences with the salespeople they already worked with, then they were more likely. So to go back to Priya's point, you want to figure out who are those people when you're trying to go out and capture new accounts. You're not wasting your limited time on people who really aren't going to view you as differentiating. So if you move on to the next slide, so you take that back. So that's the buyer's perspective. You take that back to the sales side, what we see is it pays off. So those organizations who are really good at prioritizing prospects are the ones who are more successful at getting new logos. And I always think there's something interesting to be learned in the extremes. So if you look at a bar like this that includes those same choices of needs major improvement, needs major redesign, needs improvement, meets expectation, exceeds expectations, and you look at the bookends, right, that 8.5% who said they're terrible at it, and that small 5.9% who said they're really good at it. What you find is those ones who are really good at it, almost 2/3 of those were excelling at closing new business. But on the left side, that extreme, only 10% of those organizations. So there's this real strong correlation between being thoughtful and focused and prioritizing all of those prospects and accounts and being more successful. The second thing, not surprisingly, that we saw had a large impact was being able to focus on a plan. So, if you think about the old adage, you plan your work and you work your plan. And for new logos, that means opportunity planning. So again, we asked a similar question about how effective were people at opportunity planning. We focused on the extremes. And again, that small number who are really good at opportunity planning, 83% of them were killing it when it comes to closing new business. And that was 5 times as good as those who said they weren't successful with opportunity planning. So Priya, if you would, tell us a little bit more about organizations in your world. Actually, sorry about that. Got a stall on my end. Let's move forward to slide. Thanks, Joe. So Priya shared that example of the proposal generating machine. One thing I wanted to add on that is not to ignore technology, right? We talked a little bit about opportunity planning. We talked about prioritizing prospects. That doesn't always have to be a manual process. One of the other best practices that we were picking up in the study was that there was a lot of organizations who were starting to experiment with AI, right? And starting to experiment with different kinds of technology. And I think that's great because those predictive algorithms, they can help with the scoring and they can help pick up on information that maybe a salesperson doesn't see in a couple of interactions because they don't have access to the data that some of these systems do. So there's a lot of those systems that you can start to use that will help a seller in the opportunity planning process, in the prospect scoring process, to come up with a more scientific approach. The only thing I'll say about AI is that I think everybody should start to be looking into it in some way, but not to experiment just for experimentation's sake. So what I mean by that is I think it is interesting and it's going to be really important to sales going forward. I would give some caution to make sure that it's tying back to, hey, my big goal for the year is I want to capture new accounts, for example. So just be thoughtful of how that experimentation occurs. The other caution I would offer there is in another study that we do where we really focus in on like ops and tech items, organizations told us that on average, they have about 10 technology tools deployed across the sales organization, which could be things like configure price and quote tools, they could be social selling tools, business intelligence tools, all kinds of stuff. And most organizations were planning to push out 4 more on average in 2019. So another thing that we tell people to think about is if you're trying to do a better job at capturing new accounts, yes, these technologies can be critical for you, but make sure you're taking advantage of the things that you probably already have deployed and are underutilized. So with that, I'll move us to our third group of sales leaders. Now, this third group said, listen, in the marketplace that we're in, the best way for us to be able to make our number is we want to expand the existing accounts that we have. So we want to make sure that we are The expression is mine the gold that you have. We want to make sure that we are taking full advantage of the customers that we already have. So if you think about the statistic I shared a few slides ago, if only 30% of your revenues come from existing accounts, that means 70%, reverse, 30% from new logos, 70% are coming from existing accounts. So it's easy to see why this would be very important to a number of sales leaders. And if you think about it, there's a couple of reasons why this could be the easier business to go after. One is you should have an incumbent advantage because you hopefully know the customer and you have access to a whole bunch of data about this customer. The second thing is it should be less expensive for you to chase this business. One of the metrics that we collect on a yearly basis is sales cycle. Sales cycles to get those new accounts was 7.2 months. And for an existing account, so for a deal in an existing account, it was 3.8 months. So I should be able to close more business more quickly if I have a certain focus on my existing customers. The interesting part, though, is that it was not just renewal. So when you think about what sales leaders told us they were trying to accomplish, it was expand business in their existing accounts. And they felt fairly good about renewing business. They had a pretty good renewal rate across the board in the organizations that we worked with. However, they suffered when it came to making those deals bigger. So for example, penetrating other business units in a customer, being able to move from one decision maker to another, or to be able to work with the same business unit, but instead of the deal getting smaller and smaller in the out years, I'm actually growing it because I'm attacking a larger business issue. I'm putting in services. I have greater impact on the organization. So you see, again, those green and blue bars on the left are organizations who said, this is something that's a challenge for us. And when you talk to people at the rep level, what they share is a lot of reps, if not most, are still managing new logos and existing accounts. So as a salesperson, in addition to all the admin work I have to do, I'm trying to service an existing account. I'm trying to go out. I'm trying to work with prospects. I'm participating in all the lead gen activities, et cetera. And I just don't have the time to do this well. So what we did is we started collecting information about how much time salespeople are spent selling and how much they're servicing or working with existing accounts, how much time they spend doing research, et cetera. And we correlated that back to all these operational metrics. And what we found is that time actually didn't matter. So organizations where their reps were able to spend more time with existing accounts actually did not have better renewals. They didn't have better customer churn, and the strength of their relationship, so how strong the customers felt about them, wasn't any better. It was really much more about the quality and the character of the relationship they had with their customers, not so much the time investment. So I'll ask Joe to push a little pull out again, because I'm curious, when you think about the character of the relationships that you have with customers, what would that look like across your organization? And when you answer this poll, be thinking about, your typical customer. So this is not, my best customers or my global accounts, but your typical customer. We went out and surveyed them in that buyer services study. What would they say? Would they say that they're a strategic partner to me? They help me define my future direction. We work on strategies together. They have access to all my information. I really think of them as part of my team. Are they a strategic contributor? So they know a lot about me. They help me with my business goals. I view them as someone who's helpful. A solution consultant who's really more of a products and services expert. They're good at implementation. They help me apply what I've bought. The preferred vendor, which is, we buy lots of this particular product and service. I prefer to buy it from them because they have better pricing. It's easier to get the material, etc. Or am I just one of many? Would they say we're one of several sources they could buy products from? So what did we see, Joe?
Yep, so everyone's just voting, and I'll just give everyone a moment. Yep, okay, great. And I will quickly share the results.
Thanks. Interesting. And again, very similar to the results that we saw when we were doing the study. So what we see here is no one said actual partner. We had 8% strategic contributor, 58 solutions consultant, preferred vendor 27, and then 8 is one of several sources. So if we push back to the slides, I'll show you what the group of 900 sales organizations said, and it was similar. Now, what's interesting is I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that of those 900, 150 were from APAC. And APAC results were actually a little bit closer to what you guys said and a few a bit lower than what's on the screen. So the APAC had very few in trusted partner, slightly less in strategic contributor, and just as you guys did, had more in solutions consultant and more in preferred supplier. So if we think about, again, I'm trying to, what those relationships would look like, and the relationship being more important than the time being spent. The challenge, if you're at those bottom levels of relationships, then you're trying to work your way up. So here's what I'm going to ask Priya to jump in again and maybe share an example or talk a bit about how someone pulls themselves out of the trenches if they find themselves at those lower levels.
Absolutely. Thanks, Celeste. We always think that, this is a relationship that we already have. And I think it's important, just like any other relationship, to ensure you invest in it to keep it alive. We have recently been working with an organization who's one of the large IT services and outsourcing organizations, and 10 accounts give them 45% of their revenue. So now you would imagine that at least with these 10 accounts, everything would be perfect. But we have the CEO reaching out to us and saying, we want to expand and we see our next growth coming from these 10 accounts. We broadly know we need to expand these accounts, but what we are struggling is, how do we do it? And what he really meant to say is that, when you go into looking at the relationship with a closer magnified view, you realize that while these 10 accounts are like these superheroes for you, right? Everybody in the organization knows them. So they have close to like 100,000 employees, and everybody knows those 10 accounts and what we do for those 10 accounts. So it's like saying, I know Leonardo DiCaprio, right? But I think the question there is, does he know you? Because what we figured out is that the relationship they had with those 10 accounts, though it was a large wallet share, it wasn't really at a strategic level. A lot of the business that they were doing there was being done more at a transactional level and not critical for business. So on that relationship buy-sell hierarchy that we speak to, it was possibly a preferred vendor. And I think this is where, to your point earlier, just having account managers build intimacy post-sales is not account planning, right? I think it's important there then, Celeste, for organizations to strategically invest in getting the cross-functional teams together and creating a strategy in terms of saying, how do we move up that relationship? And how do we gain more mind share? And I think that's what that organization needs to do. We are still on an enablement path with them, and we are hoping we can be a strategic contributor for them to help them achieve that. But that's where I think the investment should go in.
You make a really good point. And I think a lot of organizations, they make assumptions, right? So they do think that Leonardo DiCaprio knows them, right? That he has a poster of them on their wall. And, one of the questions that you always have to ask after that is, well, what makes you think that you have this relationship with the customer, right? So when we conduct that buyer survey, the views are pretty different than when we conduct that seller survey. And so as a sales organization, you got to ask, am I asking customers? Am I just asking them? And more formally, am I collecting that customer insight? Because I think a lot of organizations, if they actually were honest with themselves or they got better data, they might be kind of surprised at what their customers would say. And again, the thing with customers is it's rarely negative, right? So in our buyers study, buyers didn't say, oh, we hate salespeople are awful. They said they're okay, right? So I think that as sales organization, it's really incumbent upon them to dig into what does okay look like. Now, when you get into that rigorous account planning that Priya was talking about, it's important because it is not just what's my next deal in this account. It's, am I helping them build, am I helping them with their business issue? Am I connecting all of these relationships? But the payoff is huge because if you look at organizations who really did that in our study, their metrics were substantially better than those who didn't. So if you look at the yellow bar, again, we're looking at our extremes. The yellow bar were those who said we're not very good at account planning. We don't plan and execute those plans quite well. The green bar was people who said this is an organizational strength for us. So if you look at win rates, huge difference between 58.8% and 43.9%. So 16% uplift in win rates on forecasted deals. Also, the number of salespeople who are successful. So the difference between 47.4% and 62%. So again, that 15% range of how much would it mean for your organization if you could get another 10, 15% of reps crushing their quota. So it does take, it's not so much more time. I think it's, to Priya's point, more thinking, more investment, really reframing it and using those processes. But the payoff is huge if an organization does that well. Now, in terms of recommendations, I think Priya highlighted a few things in her example that are worth calling out because we heard them in this study as well. So one is the account planning piece that we talked about. But the second thing that she talked about was making sure that you take advantage of all your cross-functional resources. And one of the things that we were seeing like world-class and the best do is start to loop in customer service. So customer service usually has access to data that salespeople don't. And sometimes it's not structured data that lives in a CRM. Sometimes it's qualitative data that comes from complaints or comments or other things. And so there's usually this untapped trove of insights that comes from your customer service team. And so we're starting to see a number of organizations have a more formal relationship. And so in the SaaS world, of course, you see people in customer success positions who have a more formal role for renewals and those sorts of things. But even in other industries, we're starting to see some of the best having a little bit more of a bridge in the customer service. And so although more time for a salesperson doesn't always impact results, it is legitimate for a seller to say, hey, I'm strapped for time. Think of all the stuff that you guys are going to have to get done, in the next week or to get done getting ready for 2019. And so having a whole other body of resources that have new insights can be really helpful. So I think that's a nugget that came out of the research. That's a real untapped gem. Let's get to our fourth and final group of sales leaders. And these were the group of sales leaders who said, listen, I'm not as obsessed with if it's new logos or if it's existing customers. Pretty confident in my lead gen process. I got to get people through the funnel, right? I got to increase my conversion rates. And ultimately, as it drops out of the funnel, I need to win more. So Joe, I'll ask you to push out this poll because I'm curious to see where win rates are in this particular group. So the question is what % of your forecasted opportunities end up in closed won? And the key there is these are things that actually have made it into forecast. Would you ballpark it at less than 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, or is it over 80%? So I got the responses rolling in. Perfect. So, wow. So a few in less than 20. So that's tough at less than 20. 20 to 40 and 40 to 60. So probably somewhere in right, if you averaged all that out, we'd be in the, the 40 to, 40-ish range. Let's take us back to the slides, Joe. We can compare that to what organizations around the world said. And by the way, APAC was exactly with the global average on this one. What organizations told us is that the outcome of forecasted opportunities were about 47% win rates. So maybe just a tick higher than what we just showed in the poll, but pretty much in the range. And that's that blue segment of the donut. And it's been in this 40, as I mentioned in the very first slide of the webinar, it's been in that 47% range for a couple of years now. And that's concerning when you think about it, because again, these are forecasted opportunities. This is saying less than half of what I think I'm going to get, I actually get. 32% are losses. And interestingly, 20.7% are no decisions. And this particular segment of the chart is almost scarier to me than the loss segment. And so I know Priya had some examples or some thoughts on no decisions, and I'd love to put a little color on that one.
Yeah. So actually, as a seller, if you had asked me a couple of years ago to say, do you ever lose a deal to no decision? I would have said never. Who loses a deal to no decision, right? Because all you do is you actually just keep changing your close dates in your funnel, and it moves from one quarter to the other. And that's what you just do, right? So we're working with this consumer durable company, and their supply chain team actually reached out with a conversation with us saying, we're struggling to manage stocks due to low forecast accuracy. And the issue that seems to kind of stand out there, so there's a bit of an echo from my side. Do you want to mute your systems so that we don't hear that? Okay, perfect. So the supply chain team is kind of highlighting this. And when we went to dig a little deeper, what we realized was because the information is being pulled out from a CRM system, and what do we do as salespeople, right? You keep changing the close date of that opportunity sitting in your funnel till someone tells you you are not allowed to do this anymore. So either that opportunity then closes or it suddenly disappears. And I think the shift in behavior that's required there, and something that we've been working there with, is how do we have clarity of criteria to lose fast? And that really comes from, building customer actions as gates for your funnel stages. The other thing about that no decision is, if you do not actually understand that you're competing with no decision on this deal, you really can't have a strategy to manage that. And we've seen the organizations who are good at picking this up and the sellers who are smart at this actually recognize no decision as a competition, and they provide perspective to build urgency and ROI for the customer to recognize that this is an important thing for them to invest in right now. And I think, Seleste, from all the things that we've done with organizations, having them cut that funnel flab and define the competition and have a clear strategy on that is the one that's really given them results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent point, because, we talked earlier about salespeople having happy ears, right? They have happy ears. And so losing fast sometimes can feels counterintuitive, right? I'm not going to give up on this. I know I have the best solution. So you mentioned in that example on the slide, what some of the techniques being used by people to force action more quickly. And you talked a little bit about, in that bullet point, insights and perspective. And it's interesting because given how many sales organizations participate, we're able to do a lot of statistics and correlations. And one of the most impressive correlations we uncovered is that organizations with the best win rates were really good. The one thing that was the most connected to really good win rates was that ability to provide perspective. The people who were really good at doing that had win rates that were 55.2%, and it was 40% for those who were not as good at that. So that, think about what's in, your funnel right now across your sales organization. If you could win, 15% more of that, what would that mean in terms of the bottom line? And it also aligns really tightly to that buyer preferences study that I mentioned. Because one of the questions that we asked in that study is we said, listen, you tell us, what do you wish salespeople would do differently? And we asked them questions like, tell us about the last, thing that you bought. What's the difference between the person who won the deal and the one who came in second? Tell me about the attributes of a salesperson you just awarded some business to. And no matter how we posed the question, one of the things that kept coming up was they made me smarter. They gave me some thought leadership. They educated me. They made me think about some things. They helped me build a business case. They provided this perspective and insights. So it was really strongly impactful. Now, I mentioned it in one of the other slides. This is the second place where the APAC data was slightly different, and it was slightly different on the lower side. So if you look at my multicolored bar here, it was 16% of the APAC sales leaders said this needed major design, and it was 50% who needed improvement. So it was more about 2/3 of all of our respondents who were on that left-hand side of thinking this was a gap. So definitely an opportunity. If win rates is your big trigger for next year, this would be a place you'd want to spend some time. Now, other recommendations in terms of, what does that mean is, yes, you need to provide people with the skills to do that. You need to provide people with the methodology to do that. You may well need to think about the systems and processes for it too, right? So there are more and more content management systems out in the marketplace that can serve up that perspective to sellers at the right time in the right part of the sales process. So when they're in an opportunity, they can say, oh, I've got this kind of contact, I'm in this part of the opportunity. Being able to filter through white papers or thought leadership assets to be able to provide something, I think would be helpful. So just thinking through, how are you upskilling people to do that on a more consistent basis? So then the question becomes is, okay, so where does that leave us? So we've shared, 4 different strategies being taken by sales leaders. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, every sales leader worries about all 4 of those things, of course, but there's usually one that's going to have the most pull in a given period of time. And for each of those, we've talked through what some of the challenges are and some of the best practices. And there's a lot of ideas in there. So there's lots of things that can be done. And, sales transformation is a word that our industry's been batting around for a long period of time, and I think everybody probably has a slightly different definition of it. But regardless, what it means is that things are changing. So everybody is looking into their sales system, and they're pulling all the levers, and they're making all these tweaks. So what we leave people with is to really think about how they're going about it. Because I would say that sales transformation is different today than it was even 2 to 3 years ago. So for example, it's more systematic versus linear, right? We don't have time to be linear. We can't say we're going to tweak A, then tweak B, then tweak C. We'll map this, then we'll define that, then we'll roll it out into this. Because by the time you worked all the way through your sales system, years would have passed, right? So you have to think of things more systematically to say, hey, I'm going to make this change to my sales process so that it better mirrors the customer experience I'm trying to create. Now I know what that means is that's going to create a difference in my comp plan. That might create a difference in my coverage model. Oh, by the way, if I change my coverage model, I'm going to have to go back out and roll out a new methodology to some new salespeople. All of those pieces have to be kept aligned but it's not a linear thing, it's a systematic thing. The second caution is it's really more of a shift than a project. And so there's a heck of a lot of work to be done, and there are surely massive project plans behind this with milestones and measures, and all of that is good and should be. But transformation isn't a project that has a nice clean beginning in the end. It is a mind shift. It is a shift in approach under which there's tons of different projects. And I think sometimes people, in an effort to do good change management, they'll brand a project and they'll roll it out and they'll finish it and they'll celebrate, and people will feel like, oh, it's done. But it's never done. In today's world, it's all about being constantly agile. I've mentioned technology a lot, and so I wanted to kind of, come back and loop back to that particular thing. Technology is interesting because in the past, we would have said, hey, go fix your sales process, go build something, and then figure out how to automate it. But today it's really more of an enabler, right? So it has the ability to change, not just to automate. I mentioned data a lot. You've got lots of data in your organization, but it may not be in your CRM. So even if you're not using fancy AI tools, go out and find your data. Start running your organization with data. And then back to, most of the examples that Priya gave this evening, this morning, this afternoon, is everything has to be aligned back to that customer path and how they want to solve those business problems. And if there's too much of your sales transformation that's internally focused, it's always going to be a click off. So I'm going to turn it back to Joe, who's going to wrap us up and share some more information about how you can get more of some of the detail behind these findings.
So much, Celeste. We do have also just a few questions that have come through.
Sure.
But before I get to them, I just wanted to quickly let everyone know that, as Celeste mentioned, we'll be sending everyone a copy of the 2018 and 19 Sales Performance Study Summary, which also highlights the 4 topics we've discussed today. There is also an in-depth version of the report that we will make available to those who are interested. So please do stay tuned and keep an eye out for that. And I'm just going to ask my colleague to drop a link in the chat box. If you also wanted to discuss any of this, we do have a no obligation consultant form that you can fill out. So that's in the chat box now. We'll also send an email to you. So just wanted to let you know, it's not the end of the conversation. There's a lot that we can keep discussing with you. So please feel free to reach out to us as well. So we just have a couple of minutes. So I'll just quickly ask one of the questions that have come through that I thought was really great in the chat box. Someone's asked, you say you have data, find and use it. What data do you propose we should be looking at? We possibly are not capturing the right data.
That is such a good question. And one of the things that I've been talking to sales execs about lately is you as a sales exec need a data strategy, right? So it's not just something you can have your IT guy have. I'm sure they can handle the technical aspects, but you need to figure out where your data sources are. Because all of these new tools, they can process structured data, but unstructured stuff too. So certainly have the data in your CRM, but you're also going to have a trove of data in marketing information systems where marketing has gone out and identified personas. They have figured out target markets. They've figured out who's trolling the website, who has intent to purchase. Lots of times there's huge amounts of that data in marketing. It's just not making its way to sales. Also from a customer service perspective, there's usually a lot. It's usually that qualitative, doesn't fit easily into a field data. They have lots of information about compliments, about complaints, about things where maybe the relationship or experience is not quite what they expected. And those would be the 2 additional things that you're never going to capture and mine that, cleanly, but you want to at least be aware of it and start to figure out as a company what's our data strategy. I think it's going to be such a huge success factor for sales organizations in the future. Really good question.
Great, thanks, Celeste. And I know we're on the hour, but I'll just ask Priya just a really quick question that's come through. And as I mentioned on the slide, if there are any questions or comments that we've missed, please do email us at askus@millerheimangroup.com, and we'll also get back to you after the webinar. But Priya, the quick question that I've got through is, how do you get exec leadership to support and stay engaged with the projects you mentioned?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question to answer in a minute.
Yeah.
Because I think even though a lot of these strategic initiatives start at the top, very often when we start our engagements, we hear the team say, okay, come in and do something for my team. And it's somewhere this whole thing where the senior leadership wants to alienate themselves from the whole enablement piece, but want to be the sponsor to it. I think one thing that we really work hard on is to help them understand that they have to be part of this conversation. And a lot of the responsibilities sit with the senior leadership in terms of the success of those initiatives that they are leading within the organization. Um, some of the leaders who are hands-on are more willing to do it than the others. I think the other element that really works there is to help them understand what would it do for them. So, that what's in it for them works every time. So for a sales leader to understand that if my people were better at win rates, what does it do for me? And once they understand and appreciate that, their willingness to be our co-partners into those conversations is very different. But really, it's a effort to ensure that we have that engagement throughout the initiative. And I think it also comes from the fact that they have lots to do, but it is critical for the success.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks, Priya. And it was a big question, so I do appreciate the questions that have come through. We are, though, out of time. So I just want to say a very big thank you to Seleste and Priya for joining us today and sharing such valuable content. I think it really gives us a lot to consider. And as I mentioned to everyone on the line, I'll be sending a copy of the recording as well as the summary study. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Really thank you all for spending your time with us and have a great day. Thanks so much. Thanks,
Thank you,
Priya.
everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,